If the brain is a set of multiple things, how is there only one mind? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. Physicalism is the idea that only physical things exist. So in philosophy of mind, that would mean that only things like the brain and neurons, only those things exist. Whereas things like the mind, thoughts, experiences, those things aren't really real. Maybe they're reducible to the brain, or maybe they're just not referring to anything, right? Maybe they're just empty terms. Whatever they are, they're not really real. Only the physical things are really real. In dualism, however, the idea is that the mind and the brain are both existent and both are ontologically distinct kinds of things. Now, one interesting thing about physicalism is that it seems like if it's true, then objects are nothing more than the set of particles that make them up. Because there's no essence or form that makes the object cohere together. All you have is just the collection of particles. That seems to be it. And it's important to remember when we're talking about this, that a set is nothing more than the members that make it up, right? There's nothing additional to a set. There's no glue that keeps it together. There's nothing like that. It's just, the set is just the members. There's the collection of stuff. This pencil is a physical object. So if physicalism is true, then this pencil is nothing more than the set of particles that make it up, right? The collection of particles that are shaped as a pencil. Now let's name one of the particles on the very edge of this pencil. We'll name it Peter. And we'll call the set of all particles with Peter S with Peter, right? The set S with Peter is all the particles together with Peter there. And that set is sufficient for there to be a pencil. And if physicalism is true, this set of particles being there, right, is sufficient for there to be a pencil. That's all you need, because that's exactly what the object is identical to. What would happen if Peter wandered away? Would there cease to be a pencil? No, there would still be a pencil, right? There would still be a pencil, but the odd thing is that when you lose a member of a set, you no longer have the same set. Now you have a different set, right? Because you have different members. So we'll call the set of particles without Peter S without Peter. And S without Peter, it seems, is sufficient for there to be a pencil as well, right? It's not like losing Peter is going to make this pencil just disappear. It's not going to become just a mush of stuff. It's going to stay as a pencil. If Peter hasn't wandered off, that means I actually have two sets here. I have two overlapping sets, right? Remember, a set is nothing more than the collection of members that it has, right? That's all that it is. It's just the members. And so we have one collection of particles that is S without Peter, and another collection of particles that is S with Peter, and those collections overlap everywhere except where Peter is. Different members, different sets. So those are two different sets, and they're in the same place. But if physicalism is true, remember, then the object is identical to the sets that make it up, the set of particles that make it up. So if we have two overlapping sets here, that means we have two overlapping pencils, which is a really bizarre conclusion. And I'm not saying that this is true. I'm saying that if that's how we define an object, if we define an object as the set of particles that make it up, then we have this really bizarre conclusion that we would have two objects in one spot. Worse, because Peter isn't the only guy that's hanging out on the side there that could be lost or gained and still have a pencil. There are billions of particles like that, right? So that would mean the same reasoning would go for billions of particles. You'd have billions of pencils overlapping each other. And that seems really bizarre. And this is known as the Plurality Thesis. And it goes like this. Any physical object O will have some particle P along its edge, which has just as good of a claim to be part of O as to be not part of O. So O with P has just as much of a claim to be the object as O without P. So both are objects that are overlap everywhere but at P. There are billions of particles like P around O. So for every object O, there are billions of overlapping O's. Now, that's definitely a strange conclusion for physicalism to have, But how does that help anything in philosophy of mind? Dualists will point out that this problem in physicalism will have very unnatural consequences when we consider psychological states. So consider that I'm in a psychological state. We'll call it state E for experiencing coffee, right? Pretend I had a nice cup of coffee right now and I really wish I was right now. That would be awesome. Pretend that I'm in this experience right now. Well, if physicalism is true, then only the brain exists, right? So the experience that I'm having is being had by the brain alone. That whatever an experience is, it's just the brain that is in the experience E. But for the same reason that there were billions of pencils, there should be billions of brains that are overlapping each other. Now, there's only one psychological state, E. So that would mean that there are billions of brains that are in the same psychological state, E. That can't be right. I'm not sharing my psychological state with anybody with two brains, much less billions of brains, right? That doesn't seem right. So the idea here is if physicalism requires the plurality thesis, then we're going to have this really bizarre conclusion in philosophy of mind that will be so unpalatable, the dualist will argue that we want to reject it. So this is the argument from the plurality thesis. Provisionally assume for the sake of argument then that physicalism is true. If physicalism is true, then we can conclude that the plurality thesis is also true. I am in a certain psychological state E. I'm let's say the experiencing coffee state. By premise one, my brain B is in E, right? If physicalism is true, then it's the brain that's in psychological state. It's not a mind that's in psychological state. But by the plurality thesis and the fact that my brain is in psychological state E, there are billions of brains in psychological state E. And that seems wrong, right? So 5 is false. I clearly don't share my psychological state with others, much less billions. Therefore, it must be the case that physicalism is false. If physicalism, starts this chain of reasoning and this chain of reasoning leads to a falsehood at the end, then it must be the case that at the very beginning we had a problem. We shouldn't have assumed that physicalism is true. Now, the dualist will argue that shows that dualism is true. I have to say it's not necessarily the case. It could be the case that idealism is true. So physicalism is the idea that only physical objects exist. Dualism is the idea that physical and non-physical objects, right, the mind, exist. Idealism is the idea that only mental objects exist, no physical things exist, so only non-physical things exist. So given this argument, you could say this is an argument for idealism as well. You can use it for either one of them. I think likely if you were a physicalist, though, you probably are going to move from physicalism to dualism and not to idealism, because physicalism is the idea that you have a physical world and there are no physical things. Dualism agrees that there is this physical world and says, by the way, we have this additional ontological category that is on top of this physical world. Whereas idealism says, let's just throw out the physical world altogether. That seems to be a lot bigger stretch. So my guess is that if this successfully convinces a physicalist, then they would go to dualism rather than to idealism. Another interesting thing about this argument is that it would prove substance dualism over property dualism. So remember that property dualism is the idea that the mind is just a collection of properties that is had by the brain, whereas substance dualism is that the mind is a separate entity from the brain. It's a separate kind of thing from the brain. And this argument would show that physical objects cannot be the bearer of mental properties. So that would show that property dualism is false and only substance dualism is true. So that makes this kind of an interesting argument. In any case, if you have any questions on it, please hit me up in the comments. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Adios.